Over the years, there have been a few Witcher theories circling around, and I've always wanted to cover them eventually. None of them are too popular, but they do come up once in a while. In fact, a couple of years ago, I made a video about one of them, where Triss supposedly cheated on Geralt with Lambert in the first game.
Damn.
And now I've decided to address another one of these theories, specifically because it popped up a few times in one of my recent videos about the next Witcher game. It was in relation to me talking about the different endings of The Witcher 3 and how that might affect the future. So in short, the theory states that all three endings of The Witcher 3 happen within the same timeline. They all actually occur one after the other. Now, calling this a theory is probably an overstatement. It's a hypothesis at best, since it doesn't really have any strong evidence to support it. In fact, there are plenty of contradictions, to which we'll get later, but basically the only piece of circumstantial evidence is the fact that the three endings occur at different points in the future. The worst one, where Geralt and Ciri possibly die. Spoiler alert, I guess. This one happens a week after Ciri entered the tower. Then, the one where she becomes a Witcher is 2 weeks, and the Empress Ending is in winter, few months later. So overall, the theory suggests that Ciri initially didn't return, Geralt assumed she was dead, he went and fought and killed the last crone, survived that encounter, then a couple of days later Ciri returned, he visited Emhyr, told him she's dead, went back, took her sword, gave it to her, she went on to be a Witcher, and then eventually she gave that up to become Empress. Let's talk about the time difference between the different endings first. I don't think there is anything suspicious about the Empress ending occurring later. After all, it's a choice that takes Ciri a while to make, and on top of that, Emhyr is in the middle of a war, so his campaign has to settle down before he returns to Nilfgaard with his daughter and future heir. Therefore, it makes perfect sense to me that this ending should happen later in the future and not only after a couple of weeks. Not to mention that Ciri's future husband has to be free from his martial duties as well. Now, the 1 week time difference between the worst and the Witcher endings is potentially more interesting. Was Geralt busy hunting down the last crone during the first week? Well, I am willing to meet this theory halfway when it comes to the idea that the worst and the Witcher endings could potentially take place one after the other. And it's worth mentioning that the worst ending is very much about interpretation. Geralt's personal epilogue does not play at all afterwards, so I think it's fine if we choose to believe whatever we wish after this ending. I mean, there are still contradictions, to which I'm getting very soon, but it's not quite as bad and unlikely as suggesting that the Empress ending happened after one of the others, or even worse, after both of them. Okay, now let's get into the contradictions. First off, for this theory to be true, we would need to throw 2/3 of the potential outcomes for the fate of the North out the window, as well as the whole internal logic for the main choices in the game. What I mean more specifically is that, on one hand, if the Empress ending ultimately happens every time, that means Radovid ruling over the North or Dijkstra taking over is just fake. It doesn't actually happen. Geralt always kills them both, Emhyr does not die, and Nilfgaard wins every time. On the other hand, the three endings happening all at once contradicts, as I said, the main choices of the game. If Ciri and Emhyr never meet to have their private conversation, she cannot become Empress, but she can become a Witcher. So for the theory to work, that means that canonically they always meet, but if they do meet, the only way for her to become a Witcher is for Emhyr to die afterwards, and he clearly isn't dead during the Empress ending. And I suppose you could say things like, well, she ends up becoming Empress anyway, somehow, regardless of whether they met or not. But I object. I disagree. The scene where you take Ciri to her father is too significant. You can definitely spot how emotional Ciri is after their conversation, which clearly affected her, and it is precisely that which sways her into choosing the path of being a ruler. Or at least, to consider it. Now, I suppose I can take some personal blame for focusing too much on other aspects of the encounter, but still, I think suggesting that she ends up wanting to become Empress anyway, even without this meeting, is just kind of cheap. Alright, more contradictions. The stories which Dandelion tells about Ciri in each of the 3 endings are basically incompatible. Possibly the single biggest problem is that despite Dandelion being with Ciri during the Empress Ending, he claims she was never seen again after she entered the tower in the worst ending.
As for Ciri, that's hard to say. Since the events on Hundvik, she is yet to be seen.
In fact, his words strongly support the idea that she either died or simply turned away from her old life and potentially the Northern Kingdoms entirely. It certainly does not sound like she went on to become a famous witcher and Emperor of Nilfgaard. Also, keep in mind that this is older Dandelion telling these stories, likely in the somewhat distant future, so we can't really say that she hasn't yet become Empress at the point where he's saying these things. Another issue is that the story during the Witcher ending does not sound like something that took place over the span of a single autumn. He talks about Geralt and Ciri being together at first, him teaching her everything he knew about witchering, and then Ciri setting off on her own path, making a name for herself, and becoming a famous witcher from the Yoruga all the way to Kovir.
Horvir, more likely.
And I have serious doubts that all of this happened within a few months while Priscilla was still recovering from her injury.
Remember, before we parted, we walked a good stretch of the path together.
And finally, there is, as far as I can tell, no tangible evidence within the events of the endings themselves. There are no things like Ciri recollecting her days as a famous witcher during the Empress ending, or any references to Geralt's encounter with Weaves during one of the good endings. And it would have been incredibly fitting if, when Ciri decided to leave her life as a witcher behind, according to the theory, she gave Geralt back her silver sword. You know, the one she got from him during the Witcher ending. That would have been incredibly significant, but no, she actually gives him her old steel sword. And things look even worse for this theory if we bring in Blood and Wine, because it always takes place at the same time in the future, and Ciri tells different stories based on whether she went to become Empress or a Witcher, and there is no indication that both of these occurred one after the other. And of course, she never visits you at all if she died or never returned for other reasons. Now, with all that said, the one question as yet unanswered is this. If we get the Empress ending, what actually happens before that? You know, before the winter scene in White Orchard. We have pretty much proven that the long-term events of the Worst and the Witcher endings can't have possibly occurred already, but what about the short-term events? What about the scene where Geralt tells Emhyr that Ciri is dead?
I do not wish to see you ever again.
Or the part where he gave her the silver sword? Could any of these have still happened? Now, I already mentioned that Ciri does not have the silver sword in the Empress ending, but why is that? Well, let me give it a try and explain to you how, in my opinion, the endings of The Witcher 3 work. So, Ciri enters the tower to stop the White Frost. Within the first week afterwards, if we made the kind of choices that Ciri does not like, she either chooses not to return at all, or is straight up so demoralized that she actually dies in the process. Geralt then kills the last crone, and his ultimate fate is left to our interpretation. Alternatively, if we made the kind of choices that lead to one of the good endings, Ciri and Geralt are both alive and simply took a while to collect themselves and travel back to the continent during the first week. I suppose you can still suggest that Geralt initially thought that Ciri died and fought the crone, and then Ciri returned the next day or something. It can work, but I don't think that's the intent. Then, in week 2, Geralt meets with Emhyr, and in an attempt to prevent the Emperor from pestering Ciri anymore, Geralt tells him that she is dead. I believe this event occurs in both of the good endings, even though we don't see it during the Empress one. Now what comes next is probably the most important part. During the Witcher ending, we see Geralt in White Orchard sometime later. How long is this sometime? Is it a day or two? Is it longer, like a couple of weeks, for example? I think the latter is more likely. I think this scene occurs just enough time after the meeting with Emhyr, and it is during this time where the Empress and the Witcher endings diverge. My best way to explain it is this. If Ciri never had the private conversation with Emhyr earlier, or if she did but he is either dead or suffering a terrible defeat, she has no reason not to follow in Geralt's footsteps and is therefore determined to become a Witcher. This in turn gives Geralt motivation to order the special silver sword for her, and then they set out on the path together with nothing holding them back. And this is essentially the Witcher ending. Alternatively, if Ciri had her private talk with Emhyr, and if he is winning the war, he is therefore in a good position, after his meeting with Geralt, to investigate the matter of Ciri's death further, and to even begin a secret correspondence with her. This in turn will cause Ciri to doubt if following Geralt is the best option, and her behavior will likely not encourage him to go through with the whole sword business. At least not this early. He'll perhaps wait to see that she's definitely made up her mind before he does it. And that could explain why she does not have the new sword during the Empress ending. I think this is the only solution that works well with everything we know and see in the game. Of course, I could be wrong. It's possible that for whatever reason, Geralt never meets Emhyr prior to the Empress ending. I'm sure you guys will let me know what you think about this. So ultimately, with all said and done, if you're a little confused, I don't blame you. I think I made it a little more difficult to understand than it should have been, but let me summarize everything real quick. So, the theory that all endings occur at the same time, ultimately culminating with Ciri becoming Emperor of Nilfgaard, is most certainly false, and requires retconning of a lot of the game to actually work. However, parts of the theory are plausible. For example, Geralt initially assuming that Ciri is dead and hunting down the last crone during the first week isn't too unlikely. There is no real evidence to support it, but still. Then, I believe that the meeting with Emhyr actually occurred during both the Witcher and the Empress endings, and afterwards they diverged. During the Witcher ending, Ciri is not influenced by Emhyr, Geralt gets her a silver sword and she sets off with him on the path. Meanwhile, during the Empress ending, Ciri's determination is shaken by Emhyr and she has doubts about following in Geralt's footsteps. As a result, he hasn't yet decided to order the silver sword for her, and ultimately she leaves for Nilfgaard with her future husband.
But as is known, an empress needs an emperor at her side. My father will ensure the right man is chosen.
Okay, and I'd like to end the video by saying something which I already implied, I think. It's that I personally like each of the three endings. I think they are powerful and emotional and should be given equal credit. I'm not a big fan of the idea that even if Ciri never met with Emhyr, she still ended up wanting to become Empress for some reason. Or that if you got the worst ending, with all the drama and neat foreshadowing, that ultimately Geralt and Ciri survived, she still returned and they went on to happily become Witchers together. I don't know, I think all this does is diminish the value of each ending. I don't know what CDPR will do ultimately. They may decide to make one of the endings canon, maybe even the Empress one, but I do hope that they don't, and I'm pretty sure that this wasn't their initial intent. Okay, I've rambled enough. If you're still watching, please let me know what you think of everything I talked about, and I thank you very much for watching. Special thanks to my supporters and YouTube members, and until the next video, stay tuned and be good. Now, with all that said, the one question as yet unanswered is this. I think I sounded a bit like Sibyl there.
Just one question left. The one question as yet unanswered in your flesh.
But anyway,